Hello everyone, my name is Marc Naro. I'm an MPP student here at the University of Oxford, and together with my colleague Cristian Iftodii, we are delighted to welcome you to the first podcast of the year. It is a pleasure to host Professor Paul Krugman, recipient of the 2008 Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences, for his contributions to new trade theory and economic geography. Professor Krugman, thank you very much for being here with us today.
Thanks for having me on.
You've recently written about Europe's technological lag. At the same time, recent US political discourse has increasingly portrayed Europe as economically weak, citing low productivity, rising debt to GDP ratio, and slow growth. Do you agree with these narratives? And what do you see as Europe's key comparative advantages today?
Okay, there's a lot of what I would call trash talking of Europe, both from the United States and from some Europeans. And of course, Europe has, there are failures. There are there are ways in which the European economy does not perform as well as it should. But a lot of the US-European comparisons come from, first of all, aggregate productivity numbers, with rather abstract statistic, which is much more problematic than people realize. And from something which is undeniable, which is that a lot of the sexy high technology stuff is in the United States rather than Europe. Yeah. But there's a lot of misunderstanding of what that means. People talk as if the fact that the Magnificent Seven are all US-based means that the European economy as a whole is doing badly, which is not true. European standard of living is rising, as far as I can tell, about as quickly as the United States. Do the walking around test. Try walking around. I've been in the affluent parts in the northwestern Europe, but you walk around the Netherlands and it does not look backward compared with walking around the northeast United States. In general, in a world in which there are some high technology industries, they tend to be clustered. Most of those clusters are in the United States, but there's not a whole lot of high technology in Georgia or Illinois. It's mostly Northern California. And the rest of the United States does fine with having California, with having Silicon Valley being California. And the same more or less is true for Europe. So the idea that Europe is somehow falling desperately behind is just not warranted by the facts.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Professor. And moving on this, Europe's regulatory agenda, illustrated by the Green Deal and the AI Act, has been increasingly criticized for harming the competitiveness of European industry, including car manufacturers and more recently AI startups. Did Europe, Professor, went too far in regulating its economy?
Okay, the European economy, there are many annoying regulations, some of which do hurt business. And that is something to be looked at. But I have to say, there are many ways. We all fall short in some important ways. And it's not clear that, that AI is the key to the future. Lots of other things are also important. If I had to say one thing that matters, I think is very important, is that Europe does a much better job than the United States at making sure that children have adequate healthcare and nutrition. And that has enormous implications for where you will be 25 years from now. The United States is failing dismally on that front. So sure, there's room for improvement. And in terms of regulation, actually, the biggest issue in Europe is not that it's too regulatory on AI and on business. It is that the European market is still not unified. Europe is still, in many ways, fragmented national economies. And that's something to work on that the United States, one thing that we have done right in the United States is that we do have a genuinely single market in North America. You do not in Europe. And that's much more actionable than all the stuff about AI.
Yes, adding on that, another controversial issue is the EU-Mercosur trade agreement, which is often presented as a strategic trade deal for both Europe and Latin America, but it's also expected to generate significant distributional effects with clear winners and losers, as illustrated by the opposition from French farmers very recently. So how can the EU limit and compensate these distributional effects at a time when the Union is struggling to maintain unity, and specifically in trade deals?
Well, there is going to be, everything you do has a distributional effect. I'm not convinced that a deal with Mercosur is especially severe. Yes, French farmers don't like it. And if I might say, French farmers don't like a lot of things. Fundamentally, there's a problem with, you cannot, I understand that there's a lot of attachment to the French farm sector is real, but it's not a lot of people. There's a lot of traditional values associated with it, but
Yes.
At this point, I think the strategic side is really, really important because my country's gone mad. We have an insane leader. As we tape this, we're just reading that our president says that he's going to invade Greenland because he hasn't received a Nobel Peace Prize. So Europe needs to reach out. Europe is a very important economic bloc. It has a lot of ability to make friends around the world, and dealing with Mercosur is clearly something that is it's putting an anchor against the craziness of the world that's largely emanating from my side of the Atlantic.
Okay, very interesting. We will have the opportunity to talk about the US politics a bit later, but maybe last question about Europe. We've talked about Europe autonomy and sovereignty, and this really ties into the outcomes of the war in Ukraine. And yet Russia's economy has proven very resilient to sanctions, more resilient than expected. What does that imply for the effectiveness of sanctions as a policy tool? And how should Europe adjust its strategy? I mean, Europe and also United States, because they were involved in sanctions.
Okay. Sanctions always, they bite, but it tends to be a very slow process. Think about how many years of sanctions it finally took to end apartheid in South Africa, right? It's nothing that you should expect instant results from unless you're willing to really have draconian sanctions, which neither Europe nor the United States has been willing to do. And if you want a measure, if you ask why haven't sanctions been more effective, look at how much European countries are supposedly exporting to Central Asia right now. There's been an explosion of exports to Central Asia. We all understand that that's not going to Central Asia. That's just being transshipped to Russia. So with European countries turning a blind eye to massive evasion of the sanctions, of course, they're not all that effective. I will say that Europe has, in many ways, risen to the occasion. Sanctions have been much weaker than they should have been. But the aid to Ukraine has been, substantial, actually quite large. At this point, Ukraine is basically, the United States has basically bowed out, and it's all European aid. And it is, Ukraine, it should be more, but Ukraine is still there. And so if anyone who says that Europe is completely hapless, that it doesn't do anything, should look at the way that Europe has kept Ukraine alive. Now, but sanctions are very slow acting. The Iranian regime is still there. It's been under sanctions practically since Ayatollah Khomeini seized power, right? So, and they've been hurt by it, but expecting it to bring down a regime is just mostly bad thinking.
Sure. And another threat is obviously Greenland. So Donald Trump announced 10% tariffs on 8 European countries. What's your views on that, and how can Europe react?
Okay. First of all, it's completely crazy. Although it's what the starting point of this is actually quite impressive, which is that those 8 European countries have put troops on the ground in Greenland, not to fight off a U.S. invasion, but to make it impossible for the United States to have a clean seizure of power in Greenland. If the United States sends in troops, they'll end up having to fire on our allies. And even Trump is not willing to go there. Probably our military, many of them would disobey the orders. So that's been a highly effective policy and enraged Trump has imposed tariffs on the countries that have sent troops. This is a highly, this is not going to work for the United States, although it could do a great deal of damage. The thing about U.S.-European trade is that U.S. exports to Europe are about as large as as European exports to the U.S.
Okay.
If you include services, we have roughly balanced trade. So there's not a case where the United States has a lot more leverage over Europe than vice versa. And it's also happens to be the case that Europe has trouble acting as a unified entity on many fronts, but international trade is not one of them. The European Union does negotiate international trade as a body. So the single market also means a single tariff regime. So Europe is actually very well placed to hit back on this, and we'll see how timid European leaders actually are. But this is kind of crazy for Trump to imagine that he can bully Europe into surrendering sovereignty over Greenland, over any place, by threatening to take away European markets. I guess I should add that also U.S. corporations have about $4 trillion invested in Europe. And the United States does not have the upper hand here.
Very
Thank you,
interesting.
Yes. Thank you, Professor. I think we'll stay a little bit on this side of the ocean about U.S. politics. You have referred a lot about Republican zombies ideas when you talk about economic policy in the U.S., which are ideas or policies that repeatedly failed but never seem to die off, such as trickle-down economy or lowering taxes for everyone. What explains their durability in your opinion, Professor? And why they are still matter of policy even to this day?
In this case is a very crude. The crudest explanation is right. Famous old line from Upton Sinclair, an American writer, who said that it's difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding it. If you ask who promotes these policies, how are they supported in the public discussion, you always end up going back to members of politicians, think tanks, and so on, all of which are ultimately supported by a relative handful of billionaires. So this is just plain rich people paying people to advocate policies that benefit rich people. It's that crude, and that's the reason why the fact that the policies fail over and over again doesn't matter. There's always going to be somebody else willing to take the check and do the same thing.
Thank you, Professor. You also touched on this, but you described Trumponomics as fundamentally transactional. Do you still think that Europe can secure benefits from trading with USA? And if yes, what is required from the European side? You touched a bit that Europe still has some leverage, but we don't see it in political declarations or policies. Does Europe really have leverage in the direct sense in the US-Europe trade deals?
Yeah, I mean, the United States, look, first of all, I'm not sure that we can have a trade deal. I mean, again, this is not the United States we used to know, and a deal proclaimed by the current U.S. government is good as long as the president feels like honoring it. This is we've just said, we had a trade deal with Europe, and this tariff threat violates that deal, and that's just months after the thing was agreed. So, but in terms of does Europe have leverage? Yeah, I mean, roughly speaking, slightly. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but roughly speaking, Europe exports around 2% of its GDP to the United States, and the United States exports roughly 2% of its GDP to Europe. So we kind of need we both need each other. The trade is hugely beneficial, but it's not. That will continue unless we have really strong, really high tariffs. I don't know how much things will escalate, but the idea that somehow the United States has Europe over a barrel on this is just the numbers don't support them. The arithmetic doesn't work.
Yes, Professor. Actually, to follow up on this, under Biden administration, there has been some renewed talk about TTIP, or Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, which basically creates a free trade zone between Europe and USA. Do you think in the near future this type of trade agreement will still make economic sense?
Oh, it definitely makes economic sense. And it should even be relatively, the distributional consequences would be relatively mild because we're talking about advanced countries on both sides of the Atlantic, similar levels of wages. This is very different from a free trade agreement with Southeast Asia, for example. And it should be no more difficult than the U.S.-Korea free trade agreement in terms of distributional effects, which was not easy to do. But it's now under current management, it's not going to happen. But I think it makes a great deal of sense. In general, if there's one thing that really, with a world with growing weight of China, I think we're going to get to that. What does the West do to counter that? A lot of it is that we need to recognize that we have a lot of common interests, a lot of shared values, as getting as close as possible to a free trade, an Atlantic free trade area, would definitely be something that is in all of our interest.
Mm-hmm. Still on economic tools and economic policies, I just want to ask you if you have some views about the Zuckman tax that we've talked a lot about in France. Just to remember, it's a proposal for a minimum annual tax of 2% on the ultra-rich. So do you see it as a credible tool, or does it risk to create market distortions?
No, I'm in favor of something like it. The market distortions I don't worry about. I do worry about the implementation. It really takes a lot of effort and a lot of political capital to make something like that, a tax that really goes after big fortunes work. But Zuckman there's nobody who knows more about this than he does. I take anything he says extremely seriously, and I haven't gone over the details myself, although I'm not sure I'm competent to, and he is. But and it's a real issue. I mean, we're seeing even more in the United States than in Europe. We're seeing the damage that extreme concentration of wealth does. So anything that reduces the ability of people like Elon Musk and Peter Thiel to warp our politics is definitely something that your default position should be to be in favor of it.
Sure. So still about the U.S., the economy of the U.S. in 2025 has clearly benefited from AI investments. But with unemployment at its highest level since 2009, the growth feels a bit superficial. You've even suggested that without this AI boom, the US might have slipped into recession. So yet many commentators suggest that the AI boom resembles a financial bubble. Do you think so? What are your views on those AI investments, and what could happen if the bubble pops?
Okay, so AI, let's be clear. For what we're calling AI, it really isn't, but I guess we're stuck with that. But it's clearly a powerful technology. I've been around long enough to remember how hard it was to recognize that a photograph of a cat is in fact a photograph of a cat. And now we have a tool, and that actually turns it, particularly in things like coding. This is a really productive technology. Yes. The question is really whether it can be monetized in a way that justifies all of the private investment flowing into it. And that looks highly, highly doubtful. It's looking more, the echoes of the late 1990s are very strong here. I don't know that for sure, but it does seem more likely than not that there'll be a kind of a wake-up moment where people say, well, this stuff is great, but I don't see how the Magnificent Seven can make enough money at this to justify all the funds they're pouring in. When that happens, it will be a problem because there's an amazing amount of dispute over exactly how much of recent growth is driven by AI investment. It's complicated because a lot of the stuff is actually imported into the United States. By the other hand, the construction of the data centers does clearly increase U.S. demand, and people I respect have come up with quite different estimates. But it's certainly a significant factor sustaining growth. When it goes away, okay, it will be a problem. It will be a pop. Now, we're not quite. We're in a situation where some of the effect of a popped AI bubble can be offset by just conventional policies, cutting interest rates. We're also, in fact, falling into economic jargon here, but we are in effect following expansionary fiscal policy, not out of some well-conceived plan, but just because there's a lot of tax cuts for the rich in the legislation that Republicans passed in Congress. So I don't think it's. I wouldn't be hysterical about this. This is probably. I mean, we had a recession when the internet bubble popped at the end of the 1990s, but it wasn't a severe recession, and it didn't last very long. And this, if anything, looks probably more benign than that. So could be wrong, but I'm not that worried about it.
Okay, thank you. But what could Donald Trump or like the administration do to resolve the unemployment problem that U.S. is currently facing?
Okay, there's a very different. I mean, the unemployment rate has crept up, although some of that is probably demographic, compositional. Sorry, it's not clear that unemployment has really, once you adjust for changes in the labor force, has gone up all that much. What we have is a very severe hiring problem. It's a frozen labor market where not a lot of people have been laid off, but there are very few new jobs on offer. So anybody who is just young people entering the labor market, people who've been laid off, because there are some layoffs, is having a very hard time finding a job. And that's quite serious distress levels now. The duration of unemployment has gone way up. Marginal groups like Black Americans have seen big increases in unemployment. So we do have a real problem. But if you ask what they can do about it, I mean, the main thing that Donald Trump could do about it would be to stop creating chaos. As far as we can tell, one major factor in all of this is that companies are reluctant to make any kind of commitment, including the commitment of hiring new workers, because they don't know what the economic environment is going to look like next year or even next month. I mean, again, imagine that you had been making investments on the assumption that U.S.-European trade relations have reached a stable point, and then all of a sudden, Trump is imposing, he's saying 25% tariffs by the summer because the Europeans won't give them Greenland. This is not an environment in which companies are prepared to sink a lot of cash into any kind of lasting relationship.
Very interesting. And before going to China, you recently wrote about the Venezuelification of the U.S. To draw the analogy with the kidnapping of Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela. I found this expression very interesting. Maybe can you explain it? And what are your views about the recent events in Venezuela? What economic impact it will have for the US?
Okay, so about Venezuelification, the classic sort of Latin American syndrome is that you have authoritarian regimes that where everything becomes a loyalty test to the regime, and not just in the government but in the private sector. And it's crony capitalism. So only companies that are in the have acquired favor, usually by bribing people, get ahead, and in which even private businesses who don't show sufficient loyalty and sufficient willingness to bribe, basically, or to abase themselves, where it's personal, where you actually face, the criminal charges or whatever, and all of that is happening in the United States. We have a situation now where companies fear to criticize Trump, fear to even admit reality, like saying, well, investing in Venezuelan oil is just not a sensible proposition, for fear of retaliation, including personal retaliation. The criminal charges against Jerome Powell, chairman of the Fed, that's an incredible departure from rule of law. It's an incredible departure from the way the United States worked just 2 years ago. So that's the Venezuelification story. It is really important to when we talk about the Venezuela adventure. Economically, it's just not significant at all for the United States. It's Venezuela is if we actually tried to occupy the place, then that gets into extremely high expenses and disruption. But meanwhile, it's nothing. That's useful comparison here. I find useful. We have craziness going on in the city of Minneapolis in the United States, with effectively an occupation, completely crazy stuff. The Minneapolis metropolitan area has a GDP that's about 3 times as large as the GDP of Venezuela. So these domestic things are much more important than foreign adventures, no matter how bizarre they may seem.
Okay, thank you, Professor. Now let's move and talk a little bit about China. When we talk about China, we often hear that its growth model relies more and more on industrial overcapacity and large trade surpluses. Last year, 2025, it even reached a record $1.2 trillion of surplus exports. At the same time, the domestic demand or consumption is relatively weak. From the perspective of your work on trade, do you think that this model is sustainable? And how should the U.S. and Europe really touch on China's persistent surpluses? Thank you.
Okay, yes. China is still investing 40% or more of GDP. It's saving more than that, saving something well over 40% of GDP. You can't find productive investments for that much savings. It was possible to invest that productively back when the Chinese economy was able to grow at 9% a year on a sustained basis, but it can't do that anymore. It can't. The working age population has been shrinking for almost 10 years now. Rapid productivity growth, it was much easier to achieve when China was very far behind the West in terms of technology. It's still behind, but it's closer. So growth through technological borrowing has to slow down, which means that's all normal. That's okay. That's a little bit of the maturing, but they haven't. They're still suppressing consumption and still trying to invest far more than they can productively invest. And so for a while, they kept it going with a monstrous housing bubble, but that's not sustainable. And now they're trying to cover it by running these huge trade surpluses, which are not sustainable because in the end, the rest of us can't accept them. There's an argument that says, well, hey, the Chinese want to sell us lots of stuff cheap, and they're willing to buy short-term government debt, and which is lending us the money cheaply. But there are too many industries that are at risk of destruction because of that Chinese export surge. Too many possibly crucial industries. There's just a distributional impact. Lots of people. We already saw that from previous Chinese export surges that the aggregate numbers may matter less than the fact that you're destroying whole communities, and then we don't want to see. First of all, we don't want to be dependent on China for strategically crucial goods because it's an authoritarian regime that has been known to use export sanctions as a way to exert leverage, and you don't want to abandon possible industries of the future to China. So this is a call for an active policy of resistance. Now, the danger is always that becomes a license for all kinds of irresponsible and poorly thought out policies. So what I'm actually calling for, I think that both the United States and Europe should have active industrial policies to defend the key sectors against Chinese exports. And ideally, we would actually have coordinated industrial policies. Now I'm dreaming about a post-Trump world, but you can imagine a world in which the European Union and the United States work together to sustain critical industries and to counter the Chinese threat, and basically, and perhaps say to the Chinese, hey, no, you just can't do this. You need to get your house in order. You can't export your way out of this.
Let's be optimistic.
Yes, actually very interesting, Professor. So you touched a little bit that the Chinese economy is slowing down. So do you think that this is the normalization of the Chinese economy, or this is a normal economic cycle? Or do you think this is a structural problem or a political one, and Chinese growth will rebound in the future?
I don't think Chinese growth will rebound. I think it will slow down because that's what happens as you mature. You cannot continue to achieve 9% annual growth when you're already not that far from the technological frontier. You particularly can't achieve that when you have a shrinking working age population. So this is, that's okay. Even, Japan is kind of the case that we look at as a cautionary tale for China, because Japan was this miracle economy that then slowed down. But actually, when all is said and done, Japan has not done that badly. It's still, if you adjust by population, Japanese growth has been okay since of these past 30 years. So this is not a tragedy, but it's realism. You cannot, China's economic growth from Deng Xiaoping up until 10 years ago is the greatest miracle in economic history. But you can't expect that kind of miracle to continue when you're already a middle-income country. I think China is doing, we talk about the middle-income trap. A number of countries kind of get stalled at a sort of, middle income, don't get all the way. China is actually doing fairly well compared with countries that have entered that trap. Their growth is not bad considering where they are, but they need to adapt to a slower growth economy.
Yes, and a recent Goldman Sachs report showed that by 2075, China will lead the table of economic powers in terms of GDP, followed by the U.S. and other economic powers such as Indonesia, India, Pakistan, and Europe, European countries below in the table. So what do you think we can forecast the economic growth for 2075, and what impact would it have for economic order if the international economic order is that changed?
Oh, 50 years ahead. We if you think about what people thought the economic order would look like 50 years ago. 1975 is when I was just entering graduate school and deciding not to go into development economics because it was too depressing. There had been no real economic development success stories. It's a totally different world now. So the idea that we can predict what the world will look like 50 years from now is, it's silly. I'm actually old enough to remember when people used to say that, Asia just can't catch up because Confucian values are inconsistent with modern economies. This is nonsense. But China, to be the world's largest economy, at purchasing power, China already is. And it doesn't take a lot for China to be the largest on multiple measures because it has a lot of people. And it's quite productive. It could be more productive. So it doesn't have to do very well to overtake in sheer size, to overtake the United States. And by many measures, it already has. How the economic order works. We had a long period after World War II when we had an economic order with the United States as hegemon. And although America wasn't ideal, it was a pretty benevolent hegemon and believed in obeying the rules. And to a large extent for the past few decades, it's really been a kind of a dual hegemony with the United States and the European Union sustaining the trading system. We don't know how that system works once one of the biggest players, arguably when the single biggest player is not a market economy and not a democracy. although we may be testing that a lot sooner, given what's happening again here in my country. But there's a lot to be figured out. But I'm not going to worry about the year 2075. I'm just hoping that we make it through to 2029 without some utter catastrophe.
Very interesting. And we're close to the end of the podcast. We touched about Europe, USA, China, and it was very, very relevant and interesting. But before we close, I want to ask you if there is a book that you would really enjoy to recommend to our audience, maybe that you read lately.
Okay. I mean, I take refuge in fairly old history, and I'm not sure it's useful to your audience, but the book that I'm in the middle of as we speak is an old book by Edward Luttbach, who was famous for having written a book in the 60s called Coup d'Etat, a practical handbook. But he wrote a bunch of interesting historical books. And I'm reading now about the grand strategy of the Byzantine Empire.
Okay.
So
that's very interesting. Yeah.
In between, opening the morning newspapers and going, oh my God, I'm also reading about how the Byzantines fought off the Slavic invasions. What the hell?
Okay. Maybe an advice for our audience. And before Cristian close, I just want to ask you if you have an advice for students in economics here at the University of Oxford, or like to a broader audience of economic students.
I mean, in many ways, I'm hesitant to do that because the careers in economics have changed so much. It's a very, very, very different world. Now, again, I was in graduate school 50 years ago, and I went to school with Mario Draghi and Ben Bernanke, and it's a very, very ancient experience. So, all I can say is, in terms of intellectual stuff, I'm actually very happy with the state of economics as a field now, because people really do spend a lot of time looking at the world, looking at data. The one thing I would say now is I worry that too many students focus too much on small questions. You don't want cosmic questions. Why do some countries develop is probably too big, and others don't. That's probably too big a question, but maybe enlarge it. But my advisor, when I was choosing a dissertation topic, they basically said, spend a few months not reading any kind of economics papers, reading history, reading the news, see what's interesting that's out there. And that's still the best advice I can give.
Okay, thank you. That's very interesting.
Thank you.
And Professor Krugman, here we come to an end. Thank you very much for this discussion. I think it was really interesting for our audience here at Oxford and abroad. And we really hope to see you here back soon. And for everyone, we really recommend to read Professor Krugman's Substack. It was a really great resource for everyone.
Substack.
Yes, Substack. And it's really popular, I think, Professor.
We learned a lot.
No, I have 514,000 subscribers, but who's counting?
Yeah, but you made it like 1 year ago, right? Or something like that.
A little.
Yes.
Yeah.
So that's great. Thank you very much, Professor. And it was a really nice discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Take care.